I'm Laurence Olivier. I'm with the Department of Theater, Dance, and Film Studies, and we are very excited today to be presenting to you a lecture by Ben Crystal, which is being supported by the Pickens Fund and the Flournoy Foundation. So we want to thank them for their generosity in helping us bring Ben here. And I'm going to give you a very brief, because we're already late, introduction to Ben. In January of this year, I was at a conference in San Francisco for the Shakespeare Theater Association. And there was some guy that they were bringing in to do some workshop with us. And I had no idea what to expect. The first night that I was there was this guy who nobody knew over in the corner. And I said hello, and that was nice. And apparently a day or so later, we had a conversation at a bar about Hamlet. And within, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I've sort of found a kindred spirit. And Ben and I were inseparable for 5 days, maybe, in San Francisco, and found that we both had very similar passions. So I am introducing you today to Ben Crystal, who is a wonderful friend of mine, who also happens to be one of the smartest Shakespeare brains I've ever met, and is an incredibly passionate and talented actor and educator. So here he is.
Hamlet. Oh, all you host of heaven, O earth, what else? And shall I couple hell? O fie, hold my heart. And you, my sinews, grow not instant old, but bear me stiffly up. But bear me stiffly up. Remember thee, I, thou poor ghost, whilst memory holds a seat in this distracted globe. Remember thee, yea, from the table of my memory, I'll wipe away all trivial fond records, all sores of book, all forms, all pressures past, till youth and observation copied there, till thy commandment all alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain, unmixed with baser matter. Yes, yes, by heaven. Oh, most pernicious woman. Oh, villain, smiling, damned villain. My tables. Meat it is, I set it down. That one may smile and be a villain. At least I'm sure it may be so in Denmark. So, uncle, there you are. Now to my word, it is adieu. Remember me. I have sworn. You know, it never really ceases to amaze me how much more sense Shakespeare tends to make when he's put back into context. And the way that I was taught Shakespeare when I was younger was in one of these. In a book, on the page. And as I said to Gemma's cast of Love's Labour's Lost yesterday, I'm working with over these days whilst here at this beautiful campus, and thank you for having me. It's a great joy to be here. I said, you know, these are called plays, not reads. And yet, for some reason, over the last 150 years or so, since Shakespeare's popularity has come back into ascendant, we do introduce people to Shakespeare in books. And it's so far away from the way that Shakespeare's own audience would have received them. And so what I'd really like to do for the next, I don't know, 30 minutes or so before I take some questions from you all, is, well, to decapitate you all, really. I need to remove your 21st century heads and place on those 21st century shoulders an Elizabethan head. A head that was wandering around Elizabethan London in the late 1590s, and then that head slightly turns and becomes a Jacobean head in around 1603. But certainly not a 21st century head. You know, the best analogy I've ever heard about how we are, in some respects, miseducating our younglings and the next generation of potential Shakespeare lovers is this, that if you went to a music class and you wanted to introduce a youngling to the works of Beethoven or Mozart, then you would give them the CD. You would not give them the massive score full of black dots. And that's essentially what Shakespeare's plays are. They're a collection of all of the various music parts, if you will. And until, oh goodness, 7 years after he died, these plays weren't available to be read for the most part. The way that they say it would have gone is that you would, Shakespeare would have written or scribbled. If you've ever seen Shakespeare in Love, one of my favorite things in that film is when they cut to Joe Fiennes late at night and he's burning a candle and he's scribbling there with a quill and every now and again dipping in an ink pot and he's writing on parchment and his fingernails are all covered in ink. And you sort of go, yeah, that's exactly, he would have been dirty and scribbly and certainly not, you know, the Bard of Avon sort of thing that he's become. But anyway, so he would have scribbled that out, and then very likely they would have, he would have hired someone with a secretary hand, if he couldn't do it himself, to write out a fair copy of the play. And then, and this tradition carried on right the way through to the middle of the 20th century with new plays. The play would be passed around the acting company, from the lead player, all the way down to the smallest spear carriers. And they would have written out their own parts in their own hands. Now this is really interesting. My Shakespeare company, my ensemble, we use these types of scripts called cue scripts, really. I never hand out the full copy of the play to my actors. All they get is a piece of paper, and there would be a line and to mark the cue, and then 3 words, the last 3 words that are spoken before they're supposed to speak, and then their speech. And then the next time that they have to speak, cue, and then that speech. And if it's dialogue, then there's many of them. But they would never, ever, ever get to know what everyone else is saying. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. Because let's say you're playing Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet, and Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet dies about halfway through the play. Now, if you're playing Mercutio, and someone hands you the prompt copy, the fair copy of the play, and paper is expensive, and ink is expensive, and writing takes time, and you haven't got time because you're busy working at the playhouse every day of your life, apart from Sundays, of course. Then what is the point in the actor playing Mercutio writing out the second half of Romeo and Juliet? Doesn't make sense, it's a waste of time. If you think about it, actually, there's no point in him writing out the scenes that he's not in either, because someone else is taking care of that. And actually, there's no point in him writing out, let's say, if Romeo has a big, long speech, as Romeo usually does, there's no point in writing out Romeo's speeches either, because Romeo's taking care of that. And that's sort of how we've gained an idea. The other thing is, of course, that when you write something out, it's a terrific aide-memoire. It's a terrific way to learn your lines very, very quickly. One of the questions that people have about the Elizabethans, judging from Henslow's diary, Philip Henslow, who was the actor manager, well, sorry, the theatre manager, I should say, of Shakespeare's company, and he would commission new plays. And from his diaries that still exist, fortunately, we can see that sometimes acting companies in Shakespeare's time had like 40 plays in repertoire. and that they would sometimes perform a new play every day. Now think about that for a moment. In Shakespeare's time, you'd get up with the dawn, I suppose, you'd go to the theatre, there'd be time enough in the morning to rehearse the dances and the fights, you know, the complicated bits, the bits that you want to make sure that someone isn't going to get a rapier through the eye or something like that. And to make sure that you don't trip over each other when you want to do dances. And then at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the play would be performed in an outdoor theatre, like the reconstruction of the Shakespeare's Globe in London on the south bank of the River Thames. And now why at 2 o'clock in the afternoon? Well, that's the best time of day to get the best source of light. And the play would finish about 2 or 3 hours later, so about 5 o'clock, 2 or 3 rings of the Southwark Cathedral that you could hear nearby. And then, in theory, I suppose, you'd be handed the text for the next day, and you'd go home and learn that, and then you'd have to get up in the morning and learn the dances and the fights for that, and so on and so forth. It brings up a lot of questions, because there's not much rehearsal time, especially for text, and not a lot of learning time either. Now, I want to backtrack a second. I want to backtrack to being given a copy of Hamlet when I was 15, and being made to read it out loud by myself in class. And just knowing that it was important, and just knowing that I should respect these words, and just knowing that they should sound in a particular way. Because as far as I'm concerned, the sound of Shakespeare, if I think of the classic sound of Shakespeare, I suppose it comes, about the 1940s, with John Gielgud and his Hamlet. And then, you know, soon after, well, actually his was sort of 30s, really. Well, the first time he did it actually was in the 1920s. But still, he was sort of the great Shakespearean of the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And then you have Laurence Olivier, and he, even though, if you go and listen to Laurence Olivier online, on YouTube, and watch his Hamlet, he sounds like beautiful, received pronunciation, the Queen's English, you know, that really grand, plummy, musical-sounding, quintessential British so-called voice. But people said that he sounded louche, you know, really sort of relaxed in comparison to Gielgud. Then you got Richard Burton in the 60s, who was really very kind of, you know, I think he wore a polo neck, and it was in a studio, and you could kind of see the cameras, and it was all very meta. And then you sort of, there's the golden age of the RSC in the 70s, and then Kenneth Branagh, of course, in his like beautiful 4-hour 70mm, or was it 35mm? Anyway, very, very epic, complete version of Hamlet in the 90s. Branagh was one of the first people to think that actually we should move away from this crisp correctness. Although if you go back and look at his film, it looks very, very beautiful indeed. But in the 80s, I think, when he did Much Ado About Nothing, he was one of the first people to ever say "yeah" in Shakespeare, in modern Shakespeare anyway, instead of "your." I think, no, it was Henry V. In his Henry V film, when he's trying to woo Catherine at the end, and he asks her if she can love him, and she says she cannot tell. And so he says, "Can any of your friends tell Kate?" But Branagh didn't say, "Can any of your friends tell Kate?" He said, "Can any of your friends tell Kate?" And people were like, "You can't say "yeah." It's Shakespeare. What are you doing, man? That's ridiculous." But it's true to say that over the last 50, 60, 70 years, there has been a move away from this sort of stand up still and declaim Shakespeare as beautiful, beautiful poetry. That's not to say that it is solely poetry, as I thought it was when I stood there in my English class. It's only latterly, since I've been working as an actor and been blessed enough to be invited around the world and to talk to various people, because Shakespeare is loved all over the world. And like minds like Gemma and other inspiring people who are starting to rediscover Shakespeare in a slightly different way. Take the speech that I just gave at the beginning of the talk. It comes very early on in Hamlet. It's Act 1, Scene 5. And Hamlet has just, when he says that speech, "Oh, all you host of heaven, O earth, what else, and shall I couple hell, O fie, hold my heart." He's just seen the ghost of his dead father. How many people here believe in ghosts? Show of hands? Cool, nice one, all right. Now, I mean, if I asked this question 400 years ago, everyone's hands would have shot up in the air. It's one of the difficult things about producing Shakespeare nowadays. Mark Rylance, the first artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe, once said, unless you believe in witches, why would you ever attempt to perform or produce the play Macbeth? In Shakespeare's time, everybody believed in witches. Everyone was very, very superstitious, as well as being terribly, terribly religious. And they fundamentally and truly believed in ghosts. So Hamlet has just seen the ghost of his dead father. And the ghost of his dead father says, hi, Hamlet, how you doing? High five. No, he doesn't. That's not true. He probably does in the Portland Ashland adaptation of it, but still, that's a different story. He says, Hamlet, I've got some news for you. I am paraphrasing. I didn't die naturally. And goes, I was actually murdered. And I was murdered by your uncle Claudius. And your uncle Claudius murdered me in order to become king and take my crown away from you. And to spend more quality time with your mother. Big news, I suppose you could call it, a revelatory experience for Hamlet. The first thing he says is, oh, all you host of heaven, oh, earth, what else, and shall I couple hell? Oh, fie, hold my heart. That first word is the most important word in Shakespeare. It was never taught to me this in school, and it's something that I will impress upon anybody who will listen, especially if I'm teaching them, sometimes people on the street, to be fair. It's the most beautiful word in Shakespeare too. It can mean anything you want it to mean. What it does not mean, what it never means, what it should never be spoken as is, oh. That's not what it means. Shakespeare, knowing that his actors didn't have much rehearsal time, knowing that he was working with the same troupe of actors every day, 340 days a year, for 20 years, that he would be able to change and adapt his writing methodology and his style to suit their performance styles. And they too knew that they would be able to adapt their performance styles to whatever he was offering them to challenge them in his writing. Now you'll notice if you go and look at a copy of Shakespeare that there aren't many stage directions there. But a lot of people now think that he wrote his stage directions into his text. And the O is one of the most beautiful and biggest ones because it essentially means emote in some way, express an emotion of some kind. In other words, you see that letter O and the black ring that surrounds that beautiful white space, and he's asking you to fill that white space with a context-relevant emotion of some kind. So bearing in mind the situation, I suppose, I am Hamlet, I am a prince, I have just seen the ghost of my dead father, and the ghost, real, actually, walking corpse. Think about that for a second. And he has just told me that he was murdered, and he was murdered by my uncle, and my uncle did it in order to take the crown and my mother. So it would not make sense to go, oh, no, oh. It's a little bit more, Molesworth. Oh, hello clouds, hello sky. It doesn't suit the context of the situation, the emotion that I'm filling that space with, in order to sort of take into account the fact that I've seen the ghost of my dead father, that my father has been murdered, that my father's crown has been taken by my murderous uncle, and that he has also taken my mother. Then it should be something more, I don't know, like, oh, all you host of heaven, oh, earth, what else? And shall I couple hell? Fie, hold my heart, and you, my sinews grow not instant old, but bear me stiffly up. It's got to be something more like that, right? Because that makes sense of everything that has come before it. And then actually, once you start listening to Shakespeare, once you start listening to the things that he's trying to tell you from 400 years ago, reading Shakespeare, if you have to read him, if you can't go and see him, or if you can't act him, or if you have not gone away to be able to learn how to act him. But reading him, knowing these things, can become like, well, to pick the week, a DeLorean back to the future. You can take a time travel trip back to Shakespeare's time and hear him almost whisper in your ear, this This is how I'd like you to do it. Try it this way. Now, this is very, very different from how people are generally producing Shakespeare at the moment. As I say, I'm really lucky. I get to travel an awful lot. I see a lot of Shakespeare in Europe. I've seen it in India. I get to go see it in Asia and Australia, a lot in America. And for the most part, the same is true throughout. There's a lot of tendency nowadays to try and do Shakespeare differently. He's the man of the millennium. He was the center of the Cultural Olympiad in the UK in 2012. It was the 400th anniversary of his birth in 2014. Next year is the anniversary of his death in 2016. Everyone wants to do something different with Shakespeare. And everyone's still struggling, really, to fight generations of memories of feeling uncomfortable in classrooms with Shakespeare and disliking him. Unless, as they say, I was lucky, I had a good teacher. And goodness knows it should not ever come down to luck to be invited and welcomed and warmed into this amazing world that he's created for us. So listening to Shakespeare can teach us so much. It's one of the things I've been working on recently, to really, truly listen to him, not just in terms of what his texts are trying to say, not just in terms of the spaces that he's trying to make, but to sort of pull away and back to what the chorus in Henry V says, the opposite of the modern tendency, which is essentially to either set Shakespeare play in an interesting place. So, for example, there was a production at the RSC of Merchant of Venice recently where Merchant of Venice was set in a Vegas casino. I have heard of a production of Pericles, which not many people know. It's a sort of corner late canon, that was set on the moon. And oftentimes, if it's not set in an interesting place, then there will be a star performing it to try and drag people back to the theatre, to try and persuade them that Shakespeare might be okay. Benedict Cumberbatch is doing Hamlet in London at the moment, or Sherlock if you want, or Khan if you really want to. But the chorus in Henry V says, you know, you're going to have to forgive us because we don't have anything. We don't have star actors. We don't have props. We don't have set. We just have the words, the space, and us. And that's the principles that I set my company up on, to try to go back to the past and learn from Shakespeare as much as possible. So yes, we use cue scripts. Yes, we try to work in beautiful spaces like this one. But we also have been trying to listen to Shakespeare in a different way. And that's why all of these things are essentially under the umbrella of what we call original practices, the explorations and experiments in not trying to bring it into the 21st century and bring mobile phones into Romeo and Juliet, because that would kind of end it quite quickly. Romeo, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. Oh, great. See you. YOLO. So we've been trying to work out what the accent of Shakespeare might be like, because I was lucky enough to play Hamlet a few years ago, and we performed it in the accent of Shakespeare, or in the recreation, a reconstruction of the accent of Shakespeare. And they've called this recreation or reconstruction original pronunciation. And it's taught me an awful lot, really, because, as I said, my association with Shakespeare, and to pick, you know, the most famous speech in Shakespeare, is Olivier. And you can go online and you can hear this, because if I do it, it'll sound terrible, but essentially it's sort of, you know, to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether, I'm not exaggerating, 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I'm sort of slipping into Gielgud now. Or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. I'm not kidding, seriously, it is about a 5-second gap. And you know what happened was that Shakespeare kind of fell out of popularity for 100 years or so. And then David Garrick, the actor, set up a festival of Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon, and then everybody suddenly got interested in him again. Then they noticed how wonderful the poetry was. Then all of a sudden, literature decided that he would be involved in the canon of great literature. And then people kind of forgot that these were plays supposed to be performed, and that they were actually poetry expected to be sort of clearly read. And so it deserved the accent of the BBC, received pronunciation. And an original pronunciation is vastly, vastly different. I'll give you a little bit of it now. And when I do, I'd love you to just have a think about what accents it reminds you of, accents that might be familiar to you. I'll do, well, seeing as it was the anniversary of Agincourt on Sunday, I'll do a little bit of Henry V, the opening chorus speech, seeing as I've mentioned it. And I'll do a few lines in received pronunciation, then I'll do some in original pronunciation, and you can see what you hear. What is it? Oh, that's it, yeah. Oh, that's that word again. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Ah, va, 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 va. So that's the speech in RP. So this is as close as we think we've got, as we'll ever get. My father, who's done all the research on this, the linguist David Crystal, says that we're about 90% right, which isn't bad for 400 years. So this is a sort of 90% accurate reconstruction of the accent that Shakespeare and his actors would have spoken the plays in 400 years ago. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. What accents does it remind you of? Throw your hand in the air, just say anything you like. Yeah. Scottish, yeah, it does, doesn't it? There is some Scottish in there. Yes? Hamilton, Bermuda, really? Awesome, I've never heard that before. Anyone else? Right? I tell you, just it's not syllabus or anything, but whenever I go into schools, and particularly the really little lovely wee ones, and I go, this is what Shakespeare would have sounded like, and I give them a little bit, and I say, what does it remind you of? And they go, Pirates of the Caribbean! Shakespeare owes an awful lot to Johnny Depp, but it does, doesn't it? It's got that sort of rhotic sound, that sort of hard R, which is often prevalent in American accents too. It's a R, 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 R. It does sound very piratey. It also, because of the way that the vowels are placed in the mouth, it engages my lower register. You could probably hear, it's not so much that sort of to be or not to be, that is the question, when the center is sort of up here and you can't sort of, it's all sort of, you can stand still and you don't have to move. It's sort of, so to bear your own heart to be, oh, for a muse of fire. It engages your lower register and makes you sort of growl. Both boys and girls do this when they learn this. Any other accents it reminds you of? Say the accent that you don't want to say because you think you're going to be completely wrong and embarrassed. I know, right? It does, doesn't it? I've had people say plenty of different parts of America. I've had people say Australia. I've had people say New Zealand and Canada. And the thing is that, in Shakespeare's time, London was a sort of melting pot of accents. And people would come from sort of Norfolk and Ireland and Wales and Scotland. And they come down to London and their accents would all mix together. There's a linguistic trait called accommodation. We all do it subconsciously. We move our accents slightly towards the person that we're talking to if we like them, and we pull away from their accent slightly to distance ourselves. It's sort of vocal body language, if you will. And so Shakespeare's actors, all their accents mixed together, and all of Elizabethan actors, people in London mixed together. And then, of course, they went to Bristol and sailed across the Atlantic to the Americas and left bits of the accent there, if you will. And later on, they got sent to Bristol and sent down to the Antipodes, and in part, that's where Shakespeare's accent is still, you can still hear bits of it all over the place. It has a wonderful effect of, instead of going to see Shakespeare, if you're lucky enough to go and see Shakespeare, rather than just be stuck with the book, of instead of going to it and hearing this sort of very beautiful, crisp sound, and thinking that is the sound of the cultured, of the elite, of an inaccessibility, people tend to tune in and hear the accent of their home. They tend to hear, it reminds them of places or that they've been to in their life, or spent a lot of time in. And so instead of listening to Shakespeare or watching Shakespeare from up here, they tend to hear and listen with their heart. When I approached Hamlet, I figured that if I was going to do this part, I probably should know what To Be or Not to Be was about. That sounds kind of obvious, but To Be or Not to Be, I mean, it is one of the greatest speeches of English theatre. It is an extraordinary speech. And a lot of people think it's about suicide. It's about Hamlet coming out and saying, you know, I'm not sure whether I should kill myself or not. And the curious thing about that is, in the play, he has already discussed whether or not he should kill himself. In his first speech, he says, oh, that this two solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter, O God, O God. And then he gets slightly distracted and forgets about suicide. Because then he sees his ghost of his father, and the ghost of his father sets him on this mission to find out whether or not his uncle murdered him or not. You flash forward a few more speeches, and there's a speech that begins, oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. Is that word again? Oh. And it's Hamlet trying to, well, basically giving himself a very hard time about the fact that as yet he has not done anything about the ghost's information. And he gives himself a real hard time about it. And he sort of hears the audience ask him, or tell him that he's being cowardly. Because in the speech, in the original version, it says, am I a coward? ? And if you think about the fact that the original actor would be performing at the Globe at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, then it's not too dissimilar a situation to this, in that I can actually talk to you all. I can see you all. I can make eye contact with you all. Think about going to see a Shakespeare play in a modern theatre. Oftentimes you sit down, the lights come down, the lights go up on the stage, you sit in darkness, the actors perform in light, and there is a wall, a fourth wall as they call it now, between us, and I can't make eye contact with you. But in Shakespeare's time, because of that two-way dynamic as well, you can't necessarily, well, I can see whether you're happy or sad or shifting or drinking water or texting or wishing you'd gone to another talk this evening. And it makes me sort of work a little harder maybe, or indeed it makes me sort of relax to see you all performing. I'm performing to see you all enjoying it. It becomes a shared event, I suppose. You come with me on this journey. You're more likely to laugh if I make a joke. You're more likely to cry if I die. And you think about the theatre masks over every theatre, the persona. That's all we're trying to do on this stage, Shakespeare is saying, you know. All we're trying to do is entertain you for a bit, to take you out of your life, or make you think about things. Hamlet hears his audience call him a coward for not doing anything. In original pronunciation, the word coward is pronounced cord. Cord. And it really struck a chord with me because actually in the original text, the First Folio, the earliest collation of Shakespeare's plays, as I said earlier, was put together 7 years after his death. The word coward has a capital C. A lot of modern editors in these versions will edit out all of these capitalized words, not realizing that they were very likely one of these silent stage directions from Shakespeare. And I thought, capital C, coward, I've seen that somewhere else. As it turned out, I'd seen it in To Be or Not to Be. He returns to that word. He returns to the stage shortly after hearing his audience call him coward and says, you know what? This isn't me coming out to commit suicide. This is me explaining myself. You think I'm a coward for not having done anything, for not having killed my Uncle Claudius. But you know what? I was a student in Wittenberg, a student of philosophy. I'm not sure whether or not I believe in heaven and hell. But if I kill Claudius, and he's innocent, I could go to hell if it exists, which I'm not sure it does. And you know what? Actually, if you think about it, If we were sure about what happens after this world, then life would be a completely different thing. People would act in much, much, much more different ways. Because if we knew that there was, absolutely knew, for sure, categorically, that there was paradise after this, or raging fires after this, or nothing after this, then perhaps life would be lived in a slightly different way. These are questions that were being asked 50 miles away by the world's leading academes in the University of Cambridge. Shakespeare was asking this question to people who were paying a penny, to people who weren't allowed to vote necessarily, to people whose greatest and biggest thoughts were how to put food on the table at the end of the day. The generosity of spirit of this man overwhelms me every single time I think about it. He did exactly the same with in Macbeth a few years later with, is this a dagger I see before me? Macbeth half hallucinates a dagger, it seems, on his way to kill Duncan, and says, is this a dagger I see before me? Handle toward my hand, come, let me clutch thee, I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. In the same universities, the academes were asking the question, is it possible, actually, is it possible to create matter by the power of your mind? Woof, koala. Woof, cappuccino. They didn't know. They really, really didn't know, much like they were trying to work out if they could turn lead into gold. And here he does. He asks the existential of questions, the question that humanity still asks itself today. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them, to die, to slay it no more, and by sleep to say we end the heartache of 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to slip perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity a so long life, for who would bear the whips and scorns of time? The oppressor's wrong, the poor man's contumely, the pangs that despise love, or the law's delay, the insolence of office, or the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. Who would these fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life? But that the threat of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, it puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus, conscience doth make cords of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment, with disregard their currents turn awry, and loose the name of action. Thank you very much. So I'm not sure how much time I've got left, actually. How am I doing? Got 15 minutes. Perfect. 15 minutes for some questions. I just wanted to sort of really take you through a little trip through the last few hundred years and where we're up to with Shakespeare and to give you an insight really into some of the newest explorations of original practices that we're doing. But I'm more than happy to talk about anything else if there are any questions. Yes, sir.
Do you find that audiences tend to perceive productions in original pronunciation any differently than they receive other productions?
Do I find that audiences tend to perceive original pronunciation productions any differently? Yeah. I think a lot of people think that when they come to an original pronunciation production, it's going to sound a little bit like the A-level teacher, the high school teacher, reading Chaucer in Middle English. I think they go, because Shakespeare, of course, wrote in early modern English. We are now speaking modern English. Chaucer spoke in Middle English, but Beowulf was Old English, right? And so they think that he's going to speak in Middle English, you know, the non esprestes tele, which is quite hard to understand. Actually, because if you were to think of, you know, like a tuning fork, ding, if you think that a theatre like the Shakespeare's Globe in London, or indeed the Blackfriars Theatre in Stanton near here, which is a recreation of one of the indoor theatres, if you think that the First Folio, the earliest copy of his works that we have, all hit the harmonic of, as close as we can possibly get, of Shakespeare, then this is the sound that it was written for. And rather than it being harder to penetrate, it seems, after you tune into it a little bit, that if anything, rather wonderfully, the reactions we have is, my goodness, that was the clearest I've ever heard it. I've ever heard Shakespeare. And it also helps, I think, as I said earlier, that people tend to enjoy and tune into the slices or slithers of sounds of their own family accent, and it sort of, it sounds more familiar than I think they expect it to. It's also faster. It was spoken a lot faster. We have two sources of evidence for that. One is the spellings in the early versions. There's a lot of elisions, apostrophes, like I apostrophe, th apostrophe, instead of in the, so if. We also have Hamlet's own speech to the players, speak the speech I pray you as I pronounced it to you, trippingly upon the tongue, but do not mouth it as many of our players do. I had as lief the town crier spoke my lines. There's also the end of the chorus speech in Romeo and Juliet, when the chorus says, is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage. 2 hours, not 3 3/4 hours, as many productions are. The first original pronunciation experiment at the Globe, they did Romeo and Juliet, and they had most of the production in received pronunciation, and they did 3 performances in the middle in original pronunciation. The original pronunciation production was 10 minutes faster, because they were speaking so much faster and moving so much faster as well, because it has a sort of holistic effect on your body as well. You might have noticed I was standing up quite straight for RP, and I kind of hunkered down a little bit more for OP. It's like going to war. But and the wonderful thing, of course, is it makes going to war sound like going to war. You know, you heard the word warlike Harry in that speech. You know, it's sort of, then should the warlike Harry. You know, we spend a lot of time working with actors trying to make the words have the right color, make the words sound like it's supposed to sound. And, you know, as war sounds, hello, I'm going to war, enchanted to meet you, there's going to be some killing, then we're going to have tea. But, you know, you say the word war in, you know, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war in original pronunciation. It's not cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. It'll be jolly. But it's cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. War. Yeah. I want to go to that one. That sounds fun. So it was faster. It was more sort of like emotional and guttural. Unfortunately, it was so fast. The director, a very, very wonderful man called Tim Carroll, had thought that what I'll do when Romeo and Juliet first meet, and they share a sonnet, and they share this sonnet at the dance, and Shakespeare gives them the structure, the poetic structure of a sonnet to show how wonderful their meeting is. And he thought, as soon as they finish their sonnet, they can finish their dance, and it will be perfect to the music and everything. And it was in the RP version. Unfortunately, they were speaking so much faster in the OP version, they finished the sonnet, and they still had about 30 seconds of dancing with nothing to say to each other. So it has all sorts of different effects, and that seems to come across a lot to the audiences. Of 13 productions, 13 plays have been done in original pronunciation, and more are coming every year. A lot over here, I think, and that's partly because a lot of people tend to think that the right way to act Shakespeare is with that RP British accent, and that any other accent doesn't sound right. But whereas in fact about 50% of the vowel sounds of original pronunciation you're speak naturally. And 50% I speak naturally, and so when we come together to do original pronunciation, some of it's easier for you and some of it's easier for me. But acoustically, people tend to love it. Hi.
In your group, do you do all male casts, and also do you have a preference?
In my ensemble, do I do all male casts, as indeed it would have been the case in Shakespeare's time, and do I have a preference? No, my ensemble is, we're trying to we spend a lot of time exploring, or most of the time exploring, what would it be like to try to recreate the kind of acting company that Shakespeare had? So I can't, unfortunately, until I get some massive grant, put them all on wage for 340 days of the year. It would be very, very hard to convince their friends and family to let them just do that for their entire lives, like Shakespeare's actors did, but wouldn't it be wonderful? One day. But I've developed ideas and methods to sort of short-circuit us towards that. But I'm not interested in trying to be authentic. I think if you try and make something authentic, then it will crumble. It's just history, you know, it's a museum piece, if you will. There have been all-male companies, and indeed all-female companies, at the Globe, and Peter Hall, one of the first artistic directors of the RSC, the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford, created an all-male company that still tours around called the Propeller Theatre Company. And they're all male. So it kind of been done. Also, in tandem with trying to recreate the similar dynamic to Shakespeare, we often have a bust of Shakespeare in the corner of the room. So when we're cutting or when we're trying to work out how to do something, or whether we should do something, we always sort of go, is it all right with you, Bill? And he sort of goes, it's your play, I'm dead, it doesn't matter, just make it entertaining, you know? And I think from everything that I know, what little I've perceived about the man, because we know so little about him, and from everything that I see in the characters that he writes, if you think about any character from the earliest, from Joan or Margaret in the Henry VI plays, Constance in King John, the Kate in Taming of the Shrew, Rosalind, Ophelia, who actually isn't that passive, and, oh, Hamlet, I'm so sorry, but like can be a really strong character, all the way through to Hermione and Paulina in Winter's Tale. He seems to be writing for a time when women were going to be able to act on the stage. And so, you know, I think he would say, Shakespeare, can we have some women in the play? And he said, well, are they allowed to? Is it still illegal for them to act? No, it's fine. Well, of course you can, you idiot. Why would you? Because if, you know, there's certainly been a lot that we've learned from that original practice. Well, my mum would kill me, I think. So, you know, I like it. I'm interested by it. I'm interested by Pericles on the Moon and Merchant of Venice in a casino, you know. We don't have a Shakespeare Foundation similar to the Beckett Foundation that goes around every production and makes sure you're doing it exactly as it is on the page. Maybe we should, but no, that's the wonderful thing. You can throw anything you like at Shakespeare. You can adapt him, you can translate him, you can put him upside down and inside out, as Gemma and I are doing with Hamlet at the moment, and we'll be performing here next Sunday. Come, it's going to be really fun. But Shakespeare will still continue, so it's wonderful that people want to try different things with him. Do I like it? Do I have a preference? You know, it's as long as people are doing it and people are coming to see it, thank goodness. Hello.
Thank you so much for all of your work on the original pronunciation, which I admire tremendously.
Thank you so much.
It strikes me that what you're doing is an effort to make Shakespeare more accessible, is at odds with what is happening now, where many companies are translating these plays into contemporary American English. And I was just interested to see what you thought about that new practice.
Can we turn the camera off? Well, it'd be very, very easy to pick, let's say, 10 examples of difficult lines in Shakespeare. I could do the same for an Italian opera and put them on the paper in front of you. You'd probably have an equally difficult chance of understanding it. You know, as I've been saying throughout today, these things were designed to be heard and spoken by people who are craftsmen at their task and who are practiced at making sense of them, like, actors are supposed to do. I think that if you were to collect a bunch of people together and they were to do an Angela Carter-esque, Bloody Chamber-esque adaptation of Shakespeare for young people, not a Bowdlerization or a Charles and Mary Lambization and sort of cutting out all of the good stuff. And by good stuff, I mean the sex and the blood and the murder and all the kind of stuff that Shakespeare seems to be kind of interested about, the extremities of the human condition. Then, perhaps they could shed new light on them. I think that when you talk about needing to translate or adapt Shakespeare, it presupposes that it's impenetrable. Whereas, in fact, having worked on a dictionary of Shakespeare, two dictionaries of Shakespeare, those dictionaries of Shakespeare, there aren't actually that many difficult words in Shakespeare that would stop you being able to understand it. The best story I heard, a colleague of mine in New York last week, because we were talking about this, and he said he was working on Romeo and Juliet, and particularly the Queen Mab speech of Mercutio with some 13-year-olds in school. And my friend said to the kid, so what's this speech about? And the kid looked at it and went, well, Mercutio's his friend, right? Mercutio's Romeo's friend. And Will said, yeah. He said, well, Romeo's upset, right? And Will said, yeah. He said, well, he's trying to cheer him up, right? And so he starts to tell him a joke. And he gets carried away with that joke. And Will said, yeah. As Lear would say, reason not the need. Why do we need to translate Shakespeare? Because we're lazy at it, because we are introducing it to our younglings in a way that is 150 years wrong and old, and because we are producing it, for the most part, in a way that we think we should be producing it, rather than actually listening to what the plays are telling us to do. And when you do that, there is nothing to be misunderstood from him, because all he was ever trying to do was, as I said, entertain. And he may be using high ways or poetic ways of exploring the human condition, but if we were to try to unpick or translate the way that he did that, it's like that old saying, it ain't what you say, it's the way that you say it. And I think if we're not careful, if we don't try and do that little bit of work to work our way back towards Shakespeare, we could be in danger of losing him. There are people who would say that Othello is a racist play, that Taming of the Shrew is an anti-feminist play, that Merchant of Venice is an anti-Semitic play, that if we keep ascribing our 20th, 21st century ideologies to these 400-year-old pieces of work and expecting them to live up to our expectation of what they should be, then we're just going to end up shoving this man and his work away from us. So, But each to their own. One more.
For plays that have multiple competing texts, where you have conflicts, like Lear or Hamlet, there's things like Hamlet saying 4 or 5 O's and then break hard, pretty break versus look there. Do you deliberately try and select texts that maximize incidences of the O word?
Why? Well, first, so he was asking, when there's multiple texts for a play, how do you choose, and do you aim for the ones that have the more O's? We're looking at that very question at the moment with Gemma's project, which we're performing at the Blackfriars on Friday night, and then here on Sunday afternoon at 3 in the theatre studio. Gemma has put together the first quarto, the bad paperback version of Hamlet, the second quarto, which is a slightly smarter paperback version of Hamlet, and the folio version, which is like the hardback version of Hamlet. And they're all slightly or very different from each other. And she's forged a play looking at the differences and those 3 characters and how the 3 texts make the character of Hamlet different. And it's only 40 minutes, so come, it really is going to be fun. But when I look at them, the different editions, that is, well, look, for example, in that first speech that I mentioned, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. In the modern edition that I have, that we had to use for the Shakespeare's words, the Penguin edition, there are 11 exclamation marks in that speech. In the original folio version, there is 1. So, over 400 years, someone has decided to tell me to shout or exclaim 10 more times than was originally intended. I don't necessarily seek out the O word, but I do, we all do, essentially, look to see what the options were. And you know, what's interesting about Jem's project is that you do start to get a feeling, and this is the most tantalizing of the things as well, you know, because we can't ever really get a view into what Shakespeare thought. We have no diaries or notes about his life, but when you juxtapose, when you put these texts side by side, you start to get a sense of the man's drafting, of him writing, of him rewriting, of him trying to work out the best way of making this line or this thought even more beautiful. Yeah, don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah? Awesome. I think that's it. Have we got time? No, that's it. I'm sorry. Listen, everyone, it really is such a great pleasure to be here with Gemma's students and with you all this evening. And thank you very much for coming to hear me ramble about Shakespeare. Thank you.